Hello and welcome to those of you joining us. Thank you for joining us for a discussion of debt finance in the creative industries. To enliven with discussion with experts, our recently launched Creative Returns Guide. If you've not yet downloaded that guide, you can request a copy on the Creative Australia website. I'm Georgie McLean, the Executive Director of Development and Partnerships for Creative Australia, and I'm joining you from our offices on Gadigal land. This afternoon, I'd like to acknowledge the unceded sovereignty of this land of the Eora Nation and pay our respects to their elders and to any First Nations colleagues who may be joining us on this call. This meeting will be recorded and shared after this session, and we have our Auslan interpreters, Ilana and shortly Beck, to join us to assist with accessibility. So thank you and welcome to them. Also joining me on this call is Jane Lovelock, our Director of Private Investment and Partnerships, who is leading this work at Creative Australia with me. And also at the ungodly hour at 5 a.m. in hotel rooms outside Manchester are Fran, Sanderson and Seva Phillips from Figurative in the UK, previously known as Arts and Culture Finance, who have produced this guide for us. Fran and Seva are almost a decade into the journey of investing in the arts and culture in this way and have generously offered to share their insights with us and answer any questions that you may have. So please start thinking about what questions you may wish to ask them and drop them in the Q&A function of this Zoom call. So for those of you who are new to this party, impact investing or social finance offers flexible forms of finance that deliver both a financial and social return. It recognises the economic and social value of cultural and creative activity in new ways. It's relatively new to us in the arts in Australia, but it's not new in other sectors. It's often applied in areas like renewable energy, social housing and disability employment. And there are many things to learn from other sectors as well as from our international colleagues. Important to note, it does not seek to take the place of grant funding in the arts, but it adds another really important string to our bow and has the potential to grow the pie of available funds for arts and cultural organisations. Now, we know it will not be suitable for all arts organisations and that it does carry a different kind of risk to simply acquitting grants. We also know that it requires new forms of capability in business model innovation, financial capability and impact measurement, all things that our sector has been calling for. To hear more, I will shortly introduce and hand over to our colleagues from Figurative, Seva and Fran, followed by Jane, who will take you through what we are doing at Creative Australia to build our capabilities in this area. So please include your questions as we go in the Q&A function, and we will endeavour to answer as many of them as we can. So I'll start with an introduction of Fran. Fran started her career in fund management at JP Morgan, following an MA in philosophy and maths, good combination, and periodic work in charity administration and fundraising. She took a fabulous sounding career break in which she travelled with her family around Europe and settled for a year off-grid in Portugal with her young family. On return, she joined Big Society Capital, now Better Society Capital, as investment director, where she worked on a wide variety of impact investing deals. Fran joined Figurative from Nesta, where she was director of the Arts and Culture Investments and Programs team. The team worked on various projects with the aim of understanding and articulating the full breadth of impact with arts, culture and the creative economy, promoting innovative funding models and partnerships such as impact investing, blended finance and crowdfunding, and helping arts and cultural organisations experiment with, benefit from and boost their impact via new technology. So welcome, Fran, and thank you for spending time with us at this crazy hour of the day. But I think we're first going to hear from Seva, and I'll introduce Seva. He is Figurative's Chief Innovation Officer. He leads on the design and development of funds, programs and advisory projects that help the cultural and creative sector to thrive. Seva joins Figurative from Nesta, where he was head of arts and culture finance, a pioneering team bringing social impact investment into the cultural and creative sector. Whilst at Nesta, Seva joined with Fran, who we've just met, to deploy the Arts Impact Fund and raise two further impact investing funds for the arts, Cultural Impact Development Fund and the Arts and Culture Impact Fund. More recently, and I highly recommend this to everyone on the call, he worked alongside Fran and our colleague in Canada, David Maggs, co-authoring the report Impact Investing in the Cultural and Creative Sectors, Insights from an Emerging Field, which was released in November last year, which explores the possibilities for new risk-tolerant funding models for creative organisations. So, Seva, if I may hand over to you now, I know you've got some slides to share with us, and welcome, and I hope you've had your coffee.
I certainly have. Good afternoon, everybody. Really nice to be here. So, yes, we're going to start our presentation, and really what we're going to do here is explain what we mean by impact investment and provide a bit of background to it. Discuss some of the opportunities that are inherent within this kind of new form of funding for the sector. And then we're going to take a quick break for a Q&A session. And then after that, talk you through some of the case studies of the investments that we've made over the last few years within our funds in the UK. So, oh yes, and of course the guide that's available for download. I think it's on request. I think there'll be further details on how you can access that towards the end of the webinar. So firstly, what do we mean by impact investment? Well, typically it's a very flexible form of finance, typically in the form of a loan, although it can also include equity, which has the aim of achieving both financial and social returns for investors. It is typically a loan. This is in the way of deploying impact investment in the most common form. It's a response to the absence of appropriate similar finance from the mainstream banking sector. I think traditionally the social enterprise, the creative economy has been perceived as being somewhat high risk by the mainstream finance community. And over the last few years, we've seen a reduction in grant funding. So this is a form of finance that's emerged from socially and mission motivated funders to address that gap. And it's certainly not a replacement for grant funding, as Georgie said. It's another form, another tool in the toolkit. We sort of recognize that not all social enterprises or certainly cultural organizations will have the business models that can sustain repayable finance. But for those that can, this can be an interesting, novel, and a very flexible form of finance. The investors behind impact investment typically are mission motivated and are interested in the social returns generated by the borrowers. And for that reason, they can often tolerate a below market rate return, by which I mean a lower interest rate on the cost of borrowing than more mainstream investors. And one of the advantages of it from a sector perspective is that it makes the funds go further. So the money that's repaid to investors can then be recycled back into those funds and lent out again to frontline organizations. Yeah, I think that's probably quite a helpful summary. Over to you, Fran.
Hi everyone, it's lovely to be here. Thanks for joining us. So this is a sort of little tool which is designed, I think, by Better Society Capital, and it's really looking at capital markets and what is available for organisations, or if you're an investor, how you might look at how you're deploying your funds. Excuse me. So if you look on the left-hand side, you have traditional investment where really investors are putting their money to work in order to deliver financial returns, and that's what they're considering. So they won't consider what is happening with that money, whether that money is being deployed in furtherance of, for example, adult entertainment or arms industry or tobacco, or anything that's actively harmful. This is a kind of agnostic form of capital where it's really just focusing on what happens to the money, whether you get a financial return. Within that kind of that's the broadest bucket of investment. You then start looking at responsible investment, where you're trying to avoid harm. So you might screen for those industries that I outlined there, where you're actually actively creating harm with your money, but you're not thinking about what positive effects might be resulting from the investment that you've made in something. And then if you move over to the right one more section, you look at the B. So this is benefiting all stakeholders. So actually thinking about how what's happening with your money might affect important positive outcomes for various people and the planet. So, excuse me, environmental investing, thinking about that, where you're actually going, what do I want to do with my capital? I would like to be changing, I would be accelerating the planet towards net zero, for example. So you're not just avoiding harm, you're not just avoiding those active harmful investments, you're thinking about how to put your money to positive good use. And then moving along further to the right again, thinking about contributing to solutions. So actually really developing those positive solutions. So it's not just investing in the sectors that might have a positive effect. It's thinking about how you can create new models within those sectors that might sort of redouble that positive effect. So within that impact-driven section, there are some, again, you're looking for financial returns, but you may not be able to find them because you've now put more restrictions on what your money's doing, or you may find some great investments, but on average, the return is slightly lower because you're looking for more with your money. You've got fewer opportunities. And then moving over towards the right, we're really in this space between what you might call market returns, slightly below market returns, where you're getting your money back and then some, at least the expectation of it, and then philanthropy over to the right. So if you think about someone who makes a grant, what they're expecting to lose 100% of their money. And if you go into that kind of middle column of the impact driven, they might be expecting to get sort of 8 to 10% returns or something. But actually, there's a whole gap between there. And that's the really exciting bit where if you think about what could I do if I was only expecting to get 70% of my money back, what risk might organizations who are taking on that finance be able to take? So it's really an exciting zone there where you're thinking about financial return, but you're prepared to take some discount on that financial return for the positive action that your money is expected to affect in the world.
Thanks, Fran. It's also probably worth saying that, with traditional philanthropy, the grant funders or philanthropists may be quite prescriptive about what outcomes they intend to achieve with their money, whereas impact investors tend to be a bit more, I guess, open-minded, provided that there's a business case and an impact case being presented by the prospective borrower. Impact investors are willing to entertain a whole host of use cases for their money. So that is one sense in which this can be a fairly flexible form of finance. So on the next slide, just want to illustrate just simply how this model works. So you've got intermediaries just like Figurative, based in the UK, which Fran and I are part of. We raise investment from public, private, and philanthropic funders. We could also raise money from individuals, theoretically. We then manage that money on their behalf, and we loan that money out to, in our case, it's entirely creative, cultural and creative social enterprises. But impact investment is, a much broader field, supporting a whole range of enterprises in the social economy, from sort of environmentally sustainable projects to things focused entirely in education or healthcare. And within the creative economy, this is a fairly new form of finance. So those organizations borrow that money, repay it, and the intermediaries pay that back to the investors, and that cycle can, repeat it again and again. And in doing so, we're trying to demonstrate the value of investing in the social economy, that these kinds of organizations can generate the social returns, social impact, and in addition to repaying the funds.
So what's the opportunity? And sometimes I like to talk about this, thinking about my move from Better Society Capital, where we were doing a broad spectrum of impact investing into the arts, and what is specific about the cultural and creative sector that is different from the broader social economy. It is a traditionally grant-funded sector, that's true, like a lot of the social economy, but it does have commercial capabilities. And I think one of the things that's really distinct about this sector is that it has a genuine B2C, so business to consumer model. And often these organizations will have a direct sort of transactional relationship with their public. They have a lot of brand value with the people who associate with the organization, for example. And they're delivering significant social benefits to communities and society. So it's really unusual to find an arts or cultural organisation that isn't socially engaged in some way, that hasn't been doing some kind of outreach or education work with their community. So that's really within the DNA of the sector, we think. They're facing increasing competition for funding. So often there is sort of a lot of organisations, a quite fragmented sector, and a limited amount of public funding. We'll usually talk about a mixed model economy. So most organisations within the sector that we look at will have a mix of grant funding, so public money, whether that's local or national, of philanthropy, so money from individual donors or trusts and foundations, and also from trading, so some sort of direct relationship with a paying public. But of course, within that, there's a broad range, and some will have little or none of some of those categories. It's an inherently creative and imaginative sector. So, often there is you're creating work, or you're working with populations and organizations, and there's a lot of imagination that goes into the work. So thinking about how that imagination can be deployed into how you're running your organization is really exciting. And there can be some structural challenges around risk-taking and innovation. So the way we express it is it's often a sector that hasn't really been enabled or incentivized to think about or invest in its own assets. So to understand what the assets are that might be generating revenue for the organization.
So what are the main use cases? How can frontline organizations, those cultural social enterprises, use investment? These are some four, fairly arbitrary, but I think quite comprehensive buckets of how this funding can be used. So number one, to expand what works already, what is generating income already. So you might have a successful service that you want to scale. You might want to move it to a new geographical area. And so you would take on investment to fund that new expanded work. In the second case, maybe slightly more risky, you want to experiment with launching a new revenue stream. So perhaps you're an organization that is working in schools with young people with a particular, drama intervention, for example. You might want to then take that into the care home setting, for example, because some of that methodology might work with the elderly community. That's kind of an existing activity, but there's a new income stream because maybe there's a new paying customer there, maybe care homes. So that'd be an example of developing a new revenue stream. Again, you might need investment in marketing to do that, maybe new staff, maybe a new computer system to manage that additional work. So that's the sort of thing that impact investment can be used for, provided that there is a credible business plan there that can demonstrate how that additional income is going to repay the money borrowed. Another common use case is to acquire property or even refurbish property. So this is we mean by capital projects. And indeed, that may overlap with the development or expansion of new revenue streams. So for example, an arts organization that previously didn't have a building, in now owning a building, it may be able to hire out rooms, space within that building, which provides a new kind of rental revenue stream for that business. In the last case, the new funding models is somewhat ambiguous, but really what we mean is, essentially new ways of raising money for the sector, new kinds of interventions. We've got one case study at the end of the presentation at an organization called Music Venue Properties that's essentially a new way of ensuring that music venue assets in the UK are safeguarded in perpetuity. We can talk a bit more about that later. But essentially, really what we're talking about is the top three cases. Those are the most common use cases for impact capital. And on this slide, we're talking about, sorry, Fran, over to you.
So here we've got a few example use cases that fall within those broader brackets that Seva's outlined on the previous slide. So you might want to fund new or additional staff. So thinking about business development or sales, which might be, within standard fundraising, or it's really building your capacity to develop those new models, or they might be in program delivery. So if you've got a program and you've piloted it and you want to roll it out. You might want to bring some staff on to do that. It might be consultants or freelancers, whether that's again around fundraising, new business models, or it might be around sort of tech development or something where you're looking to build that capacity, but you don't have it in-house, and you want to develop that within the organization. As Seva said, it might be buildings, it might be purchasing a building or undertaking a capital project to do development and develop new revenue streams from an existing building you've got already. And that's quite common for organizations that we speak to. It might be to purchase equipment or infrastructure. So IT and data management systems, maybe to understand your audience and drive your relationships with them better, or physical equipment like lighting rig, something like that, or a set that you're taking around for a show. It could be PR and marketing activities, so raising the profile of your organization and developing your relationships with stakeholders that way. Or it might be underwriting the risk of new activities.
And by that we mean, so, if a new activity doesn't go that well, you've got a cash buffer in the form of the loan to draw down and provide the cash runway until that activity starts generating cash. So the common question that we get is, well, how can I repay the investment? Well, the most obvious kind of answer is, well, profit from the new activity that's being invested in. So hopefully that will be revenue generating. In other cases, the investment may be a bridge to a metaphorical bridge, of course, to funding that's paid in arrears. So you might be in receipt of grants or donations, but you're only going to get that income once the work has taken place. So you may need the upfront cash from the investor to actually deliver the work, to do the work that unlocks that new funding. There may also be, in some cases, the possibility of refinancing, which means taking on a new loan to pay off the old loan. So that's more common in property acquisitions, where, for example, a bank may not lend you a mortgage in the first instance because it's seen as too risky. Again, we have a case study later on at an organization called Friends of the Pipe Factory, where that's possibly the route for us getting repaid. So we're providing that risk capital that another lender, more mainstream commercial lender, isn't prepared to provide. They're not prepared to take that risk. But in time, when the organization demonstrates its ability to invest in the property to generate its own income, it may be able to then access that mainstream funding, which is longer term in nature. And finally, we also look at the organization's existing reserves, existing cash on hand that they could potentially dip into to repay us. But obviously, an organization needs to be able to generate that in the first instance, which comes back to the first sort of point here, which is it needs to generate enough surplus in order to repay the investment in those cases.
And I think it's worth making the point that sometimes those profits won't be cash in the first instance. So what we look at will be the cash flow modeling of an organization. So what are the advantages of taking on this kind of finance? Well, I think the first and most obvious thing is that we're trying to make available that capital. So where I said earlier that organizations haven't been enabled or incentivized to invest in their own assets, this is about enabling them. So this is about, oh, well, we've got that project we'd like to do, but we're not sure it's appropriate for grant, but we think it's got real legs. How might we be able to get hold of the cash to invest in that idea? It is a flexible approach. So because we're looking at the impact, we are a more flexible lender, and it's very much a relationship-driven business. So we are in contact with our organizations. We really understand what it is they're trying to do. We've worked through their impact process with them. We typically will offer variations or consider variations if, for example, there's a quarter or 2-quarter lag in the cash that might be coming from your project. So it's really about working with the organization and meeting them where they're at in the development of these new ideas. If we think about our investors and ourselves as an investor, so ourselves as a direct investor and then our investors behind that, we are the money that we're deploying is all really in that C category and beyond that I was talking about in the spectrum of capital. So that's where that flexible approach comes from. It's about caring about the impact that's delivered, whether that's social impact or artistic or cultural impact. So we also may have a higher risk appetite, and how that translates in practice is that actually when we consider an organization to have a really strong and powerful impact, we might look for a lower financial return, or we might take on more financial risk than we would otherwise in that investment. It might be cheaper than mainstream finance, so you have to be careful what you're comparing to, because sometimes the organizations we are lending to actually would struggle to get finance anywhere else. So that's more of a market failure. But often we will be cheaper than the equivalent rate coming from a commercial lender who is not valuing that social or cultural impact. And it may lead to improved financial resilience. So our brilliant Chief Investment Officer, Rachel at Figurative, we actually met because she was doing a master's at the Royal Academy of Art and Maastricht University, and she wanted to study the effect that these loans had on the financial resilience of organisations. So she measured a few metrics before and after the loan at some of our organisations and determined her own sort of measurement of financial resilience. Her analysis was unfortunately a little bit blindsided by the pandemic, like so many things in the last 5 years. But actually her conclusion was that there was evidence that taking on a loan like this will improve the financial resilience of an organisation overall, as you might hope. So really strengthening the balance sheet, making it less reliant on that kind of ongoing grant funding cycle.
And then what are the risks? I'll start with the second one first. I mean, the obvious thing is that this is a loan, and there's a legal agreement underpinning this, underpinning that relationship, the loan agreement. And essentially, it means that in the worst case scenario, if an organization is unable to repay, that may lead in theory, to the investor, to the lender calling in their loan. And if there isn't enough cash available to repay that loan immediately in that default situation, that may lead to the wind up of the organization. Now, I say all of that. That doesn't tend to happen in the sector simply because, as Fran said before, it's a relationship-based business. We really, because we and our funders are motivated by the mission and by the aims of the sector, we really try and work hard with organizations to get them through difficult times. That may be through restructuring our loans, being a bit more patient. And in the worst case, if it's a kind of a product of circumstance that the organization can't repay, that's a risk that we have to accept as funders, and we would essentially write off the loan. I think cases where we might be more, we would try to enforce our rights as the lender, would be cases where organizations perhaps aren't being particularly cooperative or are not supplying us with the information that we need to help them. And in those cases, we might enact some of the penalty clauses in our loan agreements. But really, full transparency, we've lost, speaking from purely the perspective of Figurative in the UK, we've lost money on a few deals, and that's entirely because those businesses haven't worked out, and those businesses weren't able to repay the loan simply because their business model failed, and they didn't generate the income that they expected to. That wasn't because we, the investor, kind of called in the loan as such. We wrote off the loan in order to help that organization survive, or essentially lead to a kind of well-managed wind down process. So whilst I think that's uncommon, that possibility, it's still technically or legally speaking a possibility, and that's something that any prospective borrowers should consider for taking on a loan. And then the other thing to say is that the initial kind of deal-making process, so where the investor has that conversation with the prospective borrower and then requests business plans, financial models, and we'll talk a bit more about that, I think, in the next couple of slides. that process can be quite time intensive. So there's lots of back and forth conversations with the borrower to understand their business, to understand the use case of investment, so that the investor can really build up a solid understanding and prepare the investment appraisal that they take to their committee that then assesses whether the loan is approved or not. So essentially, what we're trying to say here, this isn't a kind of time free sort of process. It does require an investment of time, both from the investor and the borrower initially. But and so does a grant, right? And really, we can't comment on what's more time intensive, a grant or a loan. It really depends on the grant funder, also on the loan provider. But it is something that borrowers should be aware of. I think that's, oh, no, that's not
Yeah,
that's
so we're
not the end
going
yet.
to not quite the end.
Not quite the end, sorry. Yes, got a couple of bits on investment readiness and what we mean by that.
Great, lovely.
So we talk about investment readiness, or sometimes this might be referred to as technical assistance when you're thinking about the support that's provided. But what do we look like? What do we like to see to determine that an organisation is investment ready? Well, number one would be a strong business plan. So really understanding the kind of nuts and bolts of how the enterprise that's being funded might generate cash, what it might cost, what the market is available, to make sure that there's a good understanding there. So that would be something that we might work with an organisation on, but generally we would hope to see in place already. Really robust financial management, so an organisation that's on top of those factors I talked about, and reporting well to its internal governance, so good monitoring systems in place. So we really want to see that they understand the numbers, they understand where the cash is coming from and going to, sources and uses, etc. And maybe a bit of scenario planning around that. So, if the revenue went down, could the costs go down, etc., etc. What is your operating leverage? So, how variable are those costs if your business does vary? So really looking to see within the organisation that someone is on top of that and someone is keeping on top of that going forward. We want to see a clear social impact case. So we really want to understand that the organisation thinks about what it's doing around social outcomes, knows who it's working with, understands who the best beneficiaries are, and what change they're trying to make in their lives or in their community, or in society at large, or even in the environment. So understanding what difference it is they're trying to make, and what evidence they have that what they're doing might make that change. And then on top of that, it's having that capacity internally to work out how that's going, to understand, is that going well? What are we measuring to understand whether that impact is being delivered? How do we carry on measuring? How do we capture that data? How do we evaluate that data? So it's really making sure that we know what they're trying to do and whether they're doing that successfully on an ongoing basis. And then a really important thing we look at, and you'll often hear that investing is about people, and that's really true in this case as much as it is in venture capital or something like that. So we're really looking at skilled, experienced leadership and governance. So resilient leaders who understand, who manage a strong organization. So it's the capacity to continue delivering both those business and those impact projects, and very crucially, having buy-in from leadership. So sometimes we will see great ideas from organizations, but really what they don't have is the heft to affect those decisions within the organization. One particular thing that we know from experience is that the board of governors or the board of trustees really has to be supportive of this. So right up to the top of the organisation, they have to be supportive of borrowing the money, and they have to be supportive of the endeavour that's going to be funded with that money that they've borrowed. Have I missed anything there, Seva?
No, I think that's pretty comprehensive. I guess one question we get asked a lot is, how do you look at impact? How do you measure impact? And I think that question really, it depends on the investor. I think different impact investors, different social investors will have different approaches. For us, we are fairly, we're not prescriptive. We don't seek particular outcomes. We invite organizations, cultural organizations, to tell us what their impact is in their community. So it might be, and we have a real diverse range of impacts across our portfolio, which I think speaks to the creativity and the diversity of work that takes place in the creative and cultural sector. So you've got organizations working in schools, working to affect changes in the environment, working around community cohesion, that sort of thing. And in all of those cases, we ask organizations to tell us what outcomes are you delivering and for which audience, and then what systems and processes do you have in place to track that. We look for what we call a theory of change, which is essentially kind of a statement of what activities you do, what outputs that leads to, and which groups of service users are involved in that, and what outcomes, both kind of short and long term, are you trying to affect in that logic model. And that's a fairly kind of common approach taken by social investors, but some may be a bit more prescriptive about what specific outcomes they're targeting. So on this slide, yeah, what are the sort of things we look at during the due diligence phase? Again, I think different investors will have slightly different emphases maybe on particular things, but really these three categories are fairly common, because I think all of these things are important to assess when looking at a social enterprise or any business as an investment opportunity. So firstly, the financial model and business plan. Typically, the financial model may take the form of a spreadsheet, which has assumptions that drive the income and cost base of the business. And we look over that, we stress test the assumptions, we question the rationale behind the assumptions with the management team. We might run it through some scenarios of what might happen in the worst case scenario, what might happen in a kind of better than expected scenario. And that helps us plan different eventualities, different possibilities for whether the organization can repay the investment or not. We similarly look at the impact. And again, different investors may take, some investors may take an organization-wide view, others will try and link the specific use case of the investment to the impact, but that really varies from investor to investor. But nonetheless, being aware of the intended impact that your organization aims to achieve is going to be important for all kinds of impact investor. And we also look at the governance and the management team. So does the board, for example, have the appropriate mix of experiences and skills to support the venture? Is it appropriately diverse enough? So is it representative of the community that the organization tries to serve? Lastly, on this slide, just that point around time commitment again. So this can be a time-consuming exercise for management teams to take on. But actually, what we found is that from the more sort of, I guess, forward-thinking organizations that are self-reflective and have that growth mindset, the due diligence process in and of itself can be a valuable experience, because it's sort of like a critical friend coming in and stress testing your systems and processes and scrutinizing that. And so hopefully, if you've got that good relationship with the investor, that can be quite a useful learning experience for organizations and borrowers. So we're going to pause there. In the next section, we're going to talk about a few of our case studies from the UK, but I think we're going to take some questions from the audience in case there are any.
Yeah, thanks. And just a reminder to everyone to drop your questions into that Q&A function. I might kick off with some of our own. So you mentioned that there were some investments that hadn't quite worked out as intended. Can you give us a sense of how many investments you've made using this model, and like which proportion of them have been able to repay their loans? Can you give us a sense of, I guess, that kind of measure of success across the years that you've been doing this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we're nearly approaching about 60 investments over the last 10 years across our 3 investment funds. I think to date we've lost about 5 across all of those. In all of, I mean, to be honest, there's so many lessons in all of those. In the very first one that we lost money, that was essentially a startup kind of tech venture in image licensing. And that's something where really what they needed was equity investment, so a more patient form of capital, where the investor typically provides some deep subject matter expertise for that borrower, which we didn't have. They also needed a longer cash runway, which, again, as a debt funder, we don't have as deep pockets as typical equity venture capital style investors. In other cases, we thought that the impact model was there, so that we were confident that the organization would have achieved the impact, but the business model was perhaps too risky and it just didn't work out. So they weren't able to generate the cash that was required to sustain the business and also to repay us. So we thought that it was a good risk to take because of the potential impact benefit, but in the end, it just didn't work out. So um, yeah, uh, there's a whole host of lessons there.
Indeed, and we can benefit from them. Thank you.
Mm,
I guess one of the things that's curious that we'd be curious about, obviously, at this stage in our thinking about this work is, when you were starting this work in the UK, what were some of the kind of perceptions of it and challenges you faced? Obviously, some of the things that you've identified in that due diligence framework, financial capability, impact measurement, governance, they're really big focuses of our sector in Australia at the moment. We're hearing a lot from our sector about the need to build those capabilities anyway, but it's a different language, I guess, and a different approach, as we've been saying, a different kind of risk, and it requires a certain investment of time and new capability. Where did it land? How did it land with the sector in the UK when you were just starting out? And what were some of the kind of challenges you faced in moving in this direction?
I think it's a really interesting question and one we've reflected on because, as actually one of the challenges we've had is kind of speaking to the sector as a whole and getting that
Mm,
perception of the sector. And I think one of the reasons it is quite hard to speak to the sector, and that's one of the reasons why actually still even after 9 years, it's not particularly well known in the UK. So actually, we're speaking generally to a self-selected set of organisations who have heard about us or sought us out and thought this is a good idea. So generally, we will be speaking just by virtue of that to organisations who are more ready, who are understanding what the benefits might be to sort of actually moving outside the grant funding cycle and getting access to a different kind of money. Having said that, we do, speak at conferences and have some access to the sector. And I think I'll let Seva answer this question as well. But really, the biggest concern is that this is instead of grants. So is this happening instead of grant funding? Are we moving to purely commercial models? What does that mean for the work we're doing? And I think the thing we always say is that there are areas in which it's really important. We're always going to have grant funding. So when you're doing experimental new work, for example, that's not something that's really going to be feasible for investment because you've got to be able to fail with that. You've got to be able to make new work and take risks and do experiments. And also some of the impact work that we see is really, there isn't a buyer for that. It's by nature, it's accessible. It's not something you're going to be charging people for. And so that's always going to need to be grant funded as well. So there are areas of work that will always need grant funds. And we're, we work closely with the Arts Council UK, with the trusts and foundations. We're really clear that this isn't instead of grant funding. And I think that's one of the big concerns of the sector. I think the other one is sort of the capacity that Seva was talking about on the last slide. We are working particularly now with a universe of organisations that are severely capacity constrained, whether that's because they've had to let people go, whether people have been working all the hours God sends, weekends, etc. We're looking at a pretty thinly resourced sector, and I think the capacity to sort of have the appetite to make this structural change, take on this additional work of managing investment and managing your organization differently can sometimes feel like a pretty daunting prospect.
mm.
Seva, interested in your answers to that question as well.
You repeat the question, actually.
We were talking about challenges in rolling it out in the early stages and just, how it was received by the sector and how you managed to get that kind of new language across the line and get people to understand the offer.
Yeah. Sure. Well, I think, things like this, webinars like this are a really great way to go about it. We certainly did quite a few of our own webinars during the pandemic as a form of outreach. I think it's just about keeping the conversation going, introducing the different, or talking about the different concepts related to social investment in different formats, different ways. So we've had specific webinars on what we mean by social impact evaluation. We've had webinars on specific use cases of social investment. So what does it really look like in the context of a capital project? What does it really mean to scale your business with investment? And actually having testimonials and case studies from frontline organizations has also been really helpful in that. Sadly, we couldn't get anyone to join from our portfolio for this webinar, but hopefully the case studies, not at this hour anyway,
Yeah.
but some of the case studies, hopefully in the next bit, will illustrate really what this means in practice.
Thanks. And they will, I think, be really useful. I've got a few questions come in from the attendees. So one of them is if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit more about the role of the intermediary in this space and the technical support that intermediaries provide, and questioning other examples of funders giving debt finance to grantees directly. How important is the role of the intermediary, I guess? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the role of intermediary is really important for everybody in that chain. So in that, I think third or fourth slide where I showed the kind of the world of, you have the capital providers on the one hand, the intermediaries in the middle, and then the borrowers the front line. So I guess making investments is a specific skill set because we look at the financial analysis and we really think carefully about whether the money can be repaid or not. So I guess many traditional funders in the space, providing grants, right? So they're not looking at the repayment of the grant and the different scenarios around that. So we bring an investment mindset to it, so which gives the funders kind of comfort that their money is being looked after. There's also the benefit for frontline organizations in that I think we develop a knowledge as intermediaries about what works in the sector, what are some of the risks to look out for, and also, I guess, understanding similar issues across different organizations and being empathetic towards that. So I think that can be quite helpful. There are probably other things that slip my mind now. I mean, we actually have a dedicated impact manager within our organization that provides some support to frontline organizations with their impact evaluation processes. Fran, I don't know if you want to come in there as well.
Yeah, I think so. So it's really about that. It's quite instructive to think about why Esme Fairbairn actually was involved in the genesis of the Arts Impact Fund, because they already had a social impact investment pot and they were trying to make loans directly to the arts sector and they really weren't getting that traction. So for them, the motivation behind setting up the Arts Impact Fund and developing those intermediary capabilities within Nesta were really to have that kind of shop window for the sector. So to understand, to build those skills within an intermediary base. So for them, it was really kind of a skills development to help the sector understand what the potential was for this kind of finance. And I think the other thing I'd add there is the sort of peer learning. So Seva mentioned earlier that we will often get organisations to talk on webinars about how they've used the impact investment. We also host yearly. We've gone back to this year after a blip in after the pandemic, but a yearly portfolio day where our organisations come and meet each other, discuss their experience with us. So we're also it's worth saying that we take feedback and we're always kind of iterating our process to try and learn from our organisations whether what we're doing is helpful and what we could change about how we interact with them. But also just to some of them are doing quite similar projects. They might be trying to set up accredited courses or work with councils to take on assets, that's local authorities in the UK. So actually it's really helpful for them to have a kind of support network and understand what has worked, what hasn't worked for other organisations, to speak to people and be connected with people who are trying to do the same thing. So again, you're getting that kind of development of a body of knowledge, and we'd love to do much more of that kind of convening and aggregating over time, whether that's around projects that people can do and support they can have with those projects, or whether it's about kind of what works on the impact front. So actually, oh, hang on, you're doing this with the kids that you're working with. That sounds great. We could test that out and create a kind of central repository for the learning that's happening there, so that can be accessible for the sector more broadly.
Brilliant, thank you. And
And just
Fran, I
on,
just love that you are so coherent when your body is trying to repeatedly send you back to bed. It's brilliant.
Sorry.
It's amazing. Seva, sorry, were you going to add something on the end there?
yeah, just on the technical assistance point, I mean, I think that really varies on the both the kind of the wider ecosystem and the funding environment and from investor to investor. I think at the very least, all impact investors will endeavor to be like critical friends to their borrowers. And that's certainly what we try to be. So, not even to borrowers, but to organizations just looking for finance. So we might have an organization approach us, and maybe they're really early stage. They're not really quite at that investment readiness uh, stage. And so we would provide some kind of light touch feedback on what areas of their business or what systems and documents they need to have in place in order to get to that point. But we as a team don't have the capacity to really work in depth with organizations to write their business plan or do their kind of scenario modeling for them. But that might be different for other investors that maybe do have budget and capacity to do that work. In the UK, we've also had various rounds of investment readiness technical assistance programs that are essentially grant pots that pay for some consultancy to help organizations to prepare and engage with social investment. But that varies, I think, from country to country, jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So I think it's important to sort of be aware of, that wider ecosystem of support. I don't know, Georgie, Jane, whether you can comment on that in the Australian context.
Absolutely. And I was thinking we're actually getting a few questions about what's happening in Australia that I think will be well responded to by Jane's presentation we're going to get to in a moment. There's just a couple more questions that are more kind of, and obviously questions about use cases that I think will be addressed by some of your case studies. But there's just a question that's come in that's more technical in nature about the average length in terms of time for loans in the finance you've provided. And what would you say is the average loan interest rate? We've had this question before. Are you,
Sure.
can you speak in averages? I know they're kind
Yeah.
of close to the opportunity, but is there a kind of a broad sense you can give the attendees here of the kind of length of time and the terms?
Yeah, so again, that's really dependent on the fund and from investor to investor. Our main open fund, for example, can make loans of up to 10 years in length. Our very first fund could only go up to 5 years. But really, I think on average, you're looking at the sort of 5, 6 year mark for different borrowers. But to be honest, I think it really does depend on the maximum length of time offered. I think for many organizations in the cultural sector, having a longer repayment time frame is sometimes more helpful because it means that the monthly repayment amounts are lower. It does mean that you're paying more interest over the life of the loan, though, so that kind of has to be taken into account. It also depends on the amount of money that you're borrowing, right? Because if you're taking on $1 million, repaying that over, say, a 3 to 4 year period, I mean, then you're looking at a really quite aggressive repayment profile. So you need to be able to generate that cash in the short term in order to service that loan. So if you're taking on a longer term loan, sorry, a larger loan, a longer term may be more helpful in those cases. In terms of the interest rate, for us, it really varies depending on the financial risk. And a big factor in that for our current open fund is whether there's property available to act as collateral, to act as security for us as a lender. So if there is that collateral available, we can offer a lower interest rate than if it's an entirely unsecured loan. But there are lots of factors that play into that. So the experience of the management team, the track record in delivering that kind of service previously. I can say that across our whole portfolio, our average interest rate is about 5.5%. But again, that masks a lot of kind of risk differences. So the availability of security being the most important one.
Brilliant. Thanks, Seva. Now I've got a couple of questions that might be really lovely segues into your discussion of use cases. So One of them is we're a startup and quite small. How does a small organization get into this space? And the other was other examples where investors buy a building and then lease it to a cultural organization at a low lease rate. The investment is in the building capital raise and the impacts of the work the org delivers. So I know that you've got some discussions of some examples that might speak to that coming up. Not sure if you want to answer them in shorthand now or just go straight to the presentation where you might be able to flesh those out in more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. Just thinking about the very first question there.
Was well, how do a
Do you want me
small
to
get
cover
in?
that one?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
essentially, go on, Fran.
no, go Seva.
Yeah, I think there is a tendency, particularly with the kind of loan amounts that we're dealing with. So our minimum ticket size, loan size is 150,000 UK pounds. That's about $300,000, all the way up to £1 million. But you might think that that kind of lends itself to larger organizations, but we have actually had in our portfolio, and we talk about those case studies, really early stage, essentially brand new organizations applying for funding. So it's not there's no kind of hard and fast rules about what we can and can't fund and what we can and can't look at. It all depends on the experience of the team in place, the credibility of the plan, the past experience of taking on finance. And that second question about the cultural lease stuff, we can get to that in a second. Fran, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, I guess on balance, there is probably a broad correlation between organization size, which you might measure in terms of balance sheet or in terms of number of employees or in terms of overall revenues, average revenues, and the loan size. But as Seva says, that doesn't necessarily hold. We're looking for a project that can deliver. That we've got quite tight confidence limits around what it can deliver and a team who can deliver that. But the bigger limitation really comes in that bracket of what loan size we have available, and that really comes out of the economics of the funds when we design them. So the Cultural Impact Development Fund, our second fund, we could go down to £25,000. If you get smaller than that, it's just you need too big a team to distribute the funds. So the economics stop working and a lot of money gets absorbed in employing people at the intermediary. So there is experimentation that has to happen around that, but generally that's why we're skewing towards bigger loans. But we actually did find when we had those smaller loans available that the level of investment readiness in the applications we were seeing was on balance was lower. So we have found that those larger loans were a little bit easier to make in terms of looking at the investment readiness of organizations. But that's, as Seva says, that's not a hard and fast rule. It's not necessary or sufficient to be a large organization. And we have funded small organizations pretty successfully. It's just about, making sure that you're there in terms of investment readiness. And that can be obviously more challenging if you're capacity constrained, literally, and that you don't only have a few people working in the organization.
Yeah, indeed. So Seva, do we want to go to those use cases now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to share my
Just
screen again.
while you're sharing, I just want to pay tribute to our extraordinary Auslan interpreters who are keeping up with this really complex conversation. So thank you very much. All right.
Extremely impressive.
Yeah, great. So yes, just to kind of put a bit of color into this narrative, just going to walk you through a few of the examples from our portfolio. So the first one, I appreciate there's quite a lot of information on the slide, so I'm going to leave this on. There's a few pictures that illustrate what they do shortly. But yeah, the first organization is called Pink College. They are a provider of alternative creative education for neurodivergent young people in the UK. They started in the north of England, in Manchester, actually, kind of where me and Fran are speaking from at the moment. So what was really cool about this is the actual model. So their idea was that they will provide this alternative education within cultural venues. So they would take kids who weren't really getting on with the mainstream education sector and provide this provision within museums, within art galleries. They would hire out a kind of workshop area in those spaces and deliver that education, those classes there. And that solves a problem for the museums in helping them access a more diverse and younger audience group that probably, being part of Pink College course would have been the very first time that many of those young people would have accessed those, gone to those venues. And actually, we paid a visit to one of the galleries actually that they were in Manchester, and it was a really inspiring place. And I kind of wish, God, I wish I was, when I went to school, I was at such a grand building as that, and have all this amazing art on the walls that, yeah, it's very creatively inspiring. So this organization's business model was almost entirely trading. So it would charge a fee to schools to provide that service. And it was, I think, free for museums to take part in the scheme. When they approached this, they were operating in two cultural venues in Manchester. Sorry, not sure what's going on. There's a fire on my head. Sorry, it's going to be.
Oh my God. Okay.
Apologies. That is unexpected at 6 a.m. We would have woken
Weird.
everybody up.
Oh
And
my
it's just
God.
gone off. Sorry about that.
Are you okay, Seva?
Yeah, I think it's all good. It just stopped. So it's a
Okay,
wake-up
let us
call
know
that
if
I
you need to go
certainly didn't
anywhere.
order. Yeah, hopefully that wasn't too disruptive.
We couldn't hear it at
My
all.
first,
Yeah.
you can hear it at all. Okay,
No,
right,
no.
okay, great. My noise cancelling is definitely doing its job.
Yeah.
Let me just see. Let's go back to that presentation.
While you're doing that, I'll jump in and say that we're actually, I checked, we're out of date on this slide, and it's 13 different venues now. So I thought I had an inkling. So this is a scaling live. Since we wrote this slide, they've got 13 different venues.
Brilliant.
Yes, yeah. So essentially, they took on a loan from us to expand to other sites, and they fully repaid in March last year. This is a real success story in the sector and in our portfolio, in that you can see from the income at approval of our loan to where they're at currently. I mean, actually, their income will be well in excess of £1 million a year now. But they experienced rapid growth. Also, during that time, the organization experienced a high degree of sort of professionalization within its team. So actually, I think when they approached this, there was only sort of 2 or 3 members of staff. Now there's over 50.
Wow.
So for the entrepreneur in question, there was a lot of learning to do around finding appropriate support at the board level, but also putting in place all the policies and procedures to essentially manage this organization to ensure consistency of service delivery, to look after their staff. So yeah, this is a bit of information on this is from the website of the organization about the kind of service that it offers and what makes it unique. And a few examples of the kind of venues that it has been based in over the last few years. So I guess the key takeaway there is that Pink College is not your typical arts organization, but it's using creativity in a different and innovative way, and it's solving a problem for multiple audience groups, so for schools and for the cultural sector. Yeah, so I hope it's a little bit inspiring. Then in this example, I don't know, Fran, do you want to talk about this one? Fran?
Yeah, sure. Sorry. My connection's a bit unstable, so do jump in for me if I drop
Sure.
off. So Friends of the Pipe Factory is an old industrial site in Glasgow, and they have been so as a group of entrepreneurs have decided to take that into a sort of arts venue. So repurposing, and you'll see when you get to the picture of the venue, it's really significant, beautiful old heritage building in an area of quite high deprivation. So it's really kind of using that cultural offer to support local regeneration in the Barras in Glasgow. So a really beautiful building. They came to us to get the initial funding to start while they were applying for really quite significant grants to undertake the rest of the development. So they were really able to get going in a small repurposed floor plan, and they have now, I think they're launching, in fact, this Saturday, aren't they? Oh no, they're closing for the redevelopment this Saturday. So they're having kind of a closing party while the significant works that they have now got the funding for undertake. But they've got artists in there, they've got creative workspace, they've got messy workspace, and they do a lot of work with the local community. And what's really interesting about this is that the funding from us enabled them to develop that track record, start proving the concept, and really present themselves to the onward financiers as a going concern, which is something they wouldn't have been able to do without our funding. So that's a really exciting proposal, and it really kind of speaks to that ability of culture and the cultural sector to lead local regeneration and to really kind of revitalize communities.
Yeah, so just worth saying here that, this is the building. There's 5 floors there. Most of those floors, or all of them, in fact, when we first looked at this, were kind of empty, in need of extensive renovation. There were no toilets on most of the floors, only on the ground floor. And so the vision for this site is for it to become a multi-purpose community hub with some floor space available for rental for kind of community social enterprise type of businesses that would, pay rent to the pipe factory organization. And this was, entirely new sort of project. They were quite lucky in that they had somebody on board who was experienced in the world of kind of business and finance, and really provided some useful insight and experience in writing that business plan. This was also a partnership with a number of different community groups that all came together to make this happen. So yeah, and I think our investors really like that community building angle to this investment. Again, these are some images of what it looks like inside. Great, and this example, Music Venue Properties, really speaks to that. Buying assets and then leasing them back to the sector at more affordable rates. So in the UK, we have a real crisis in the grassroots music venue scene. So venues are shutting down, particularly following the pandemic, at a really rapid pace because costs are simply going up, utilities costs, but at the same time, audiences are not kind of returning to venues at the same rate, at the same kind of capacity as they did prior to the pandemic. Bar spends are down, and people are drinking less. And that's all having a really detrimental effect to the live music sector. So we have in the UK this organization called the Music Venue Trust, which is a national charity that campaigns for and advocates for the grassroots music sector. They had this idea of creating a new company called Music Venue Properties. The aim of this company would be to buy up freeholds and long leaseholds on grassroots music venues, and then lease those venues back to music operators at affordable rates. So again, this was an entirely new project when they approached this. They needed capital, initial startup capital to buy up the first cohort of properties. I think there were 6 in the initial pipeline. And the business model of it would be entirely rental based. So they would get fees from the music venue operators for their services. And in addition to holding these assets in perpetuity in the trust, they would also provide some technical assistance to music operators and supporting them to raise grant finance, and also provide some collective procurement services for things like insurance, energy supply, and drink supplies. So kind of strength in numbers is their approach. And obviously, the kind of holding assets in perpetuity point means that should any of those music operators fail, the venues themselves won't be sold off to private landlords. They can be held in the trust until another operator comes along. Or in the worst case, if they do have to sell those venues, those profits can be used to buy up further venues in other parts of the country. The rent is capped for those operators at 6.5% of the total acquisition costs, which is expected to reduce the rent for those tenant operators by about 20% on average. So the finance that they raised wasn't entirely from us. They got a £1 million loan from us. They also raised some grant capital from Arts Council England, which is the biggest public funder of the arts in the UK, as well as money from a community share issue. So this was open to the public, the sort of music community at large, where members of the public could essentially invest money into the scheme, and they will get a return from the proceeds of the venture in due course. So a really interesting kind of mixed funding model to acquire those initial venues. And how it's going is that they've now acquired 5 venues. There's a couple more in the pipeline. And this is going to be around for a long time, and they're hoping to constantly acquire venues over the next few years.
That's brilliant.
So
go
yeah,
ahead.
just some images really of the venues that they've acquired. So bottom right's a slightly messy slide, but the bottom right is in South Wales. I think the top one is in Preston in the northwest, and then the snug in the top left corner was the very first venue that they acquired. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. I know we've got another case study, but I'm just conscious of time, and
Sure.
I know we can find a little bit more about those on your website. Jane, obviously we've had some interest in the chat on what's happening in Australia, and what kind of the opportunities are in terms of building capability, looking at where the skills needs are in Australia, and kind of understanding what we need to do to get ready for this sort of thinking. Will you take us through some of the thinking we've got underway at Creative Australia and what we're planning to do?
I would love to. Thank you, Georgie, and thanks so much, Fran and Seva. It's really exciting to see tangible case studies of this work and how they might apply to an Australian context. Now, as Georgie said, I'm going to talk through some of the things we're doing in impact investing at Creative Australia that connect more directly with the Australian market. Oh, hang on. So as a starting point, we had Fran and Seva and a lot of other international guests and Australian guests with us in March. We did a workshop to determine whether there was interest and capacity for impact investment in the cultural sector in Australia. And we were overwhelmed by this event that happened in March. We found that there was a real interest in investment from philanthropy and the finance sector, but also from the creative industries. There was a real interest in this model and what it might do for different organisations. So from this session and the work we've done so far, we're looking at sort of 5 areas for development that Creative Australia will work on for impact investing. And the first one is really key, and I think some of the questions reference that, and this is capability building in the sector. So I'll talk a little bit more about some due diligence work we've done with an intermediary ourselves, but capability building in terms of that financial and governance and sort of operational capability that Fran and Seva were talking about, but also capability in developing a theory of change and impact measurement, and also in growth strategy. I think, interestingly, in creative organisations in Australia, often there's a real ambition for artistic growth, but for operational and business model growth, there's less of an experience of that space. So it's really building capability in those spaces, noting that these loans need to be revenue driving, and we need to look at the business models that can afford that. So capability is the first area. Area 2 is a new investment culture. I think that there is growing comfort with the word debt and exploring the use of debt finance, but it's still something that I know a lot of organisations and boards are understanding and coming to terms with. I think outside of the cultural industries, most businesses start with a loan, but it's something that, because of the structure of granting and philanthropy, we're less used to. So this is really about this work we're doing with Fran and Seva and the Creative Australia team in teaching and learning about investment culture and what that looks like. The third area we're looking at is a definition of roles, and this is a really key one that speaks to questions too. What is Creative Australia's role? How does government work in this? How do we collaborate with philanthropy and the investors? And a great question in the list too is what sort of advocacy Creative Australia are doing in this space. It's a really important part for one, as well as capability building and education for the sector. We also need capability building and education for investors in understanding how the creative sector work, what expectations to place on an investment of a creative business. So there's some work to do there. Obviously, articulation and mediation of risk, we've talked a lot about that, understanding how Creative Australia can de-risk investment, but also really helping organisations weigh up the pros and cons and risks associated with this kind of model. And finally, fifth area is fund modelling. So what would an Australian fund look like? How would that be resourced and how might that play out within the sector? So we're really at the beginning of this work, but it's really exciting and promising stuff. For us, the opportunities are manifest, but obviously engaging with the private sector, we have a real mandate in the Cultural Policy Revive to do so. So that's sort of connecting with commercial sectors, cross-portfolio government collaboration and philanthropy and investors to bring the whole sector together to invest in good creative businesses. Obviously, it's investment from PAFs and foundations. We run a program through the Australian Cultural Fund called Amplify that does so, but finding ways to make it safe and easy for foundations to invest and for organisations to receive and pay back that investment. Impact measures for arts and culture. This is one that we all talk about. We all know the immense cultural value that we bring to the sector in the creative industries. How do we capture and articulate that in a way that makes sense to investors? And the last one here is capability building, which we've talked a little bit about. How do we make sure our sector is equipped and ready to go? So in a nutshell, the things that we're practically doing to address these opportunities are we've developed with an intermediary an impact investment screening framework, which is a really great tool for us to understand what investment ready looks like for an arts organisation and how they might benchmark where they are now and where they need to get to in order to get to that readiness. We're obviously doing the Creative Returns Guide and webinar here today. We're working a lot on fund modelling, as I said before, so it's really understanding what it might look like and the role Creative Australia might play in this. We're going to run a Creative Industries Impact Lab, which is a really exciting thing with my colleagues, David Stewart in the eval program, in the eval team at Creative Australia, helping organisations articulate theory of change, impact measures. And I should say all of this capability building work is pretty special in that even if at the end of it or during it, an organisation decides that they're not on the investment track or that investment finance isn't for them, that they want to rely on philanthropy or earned income or government grants, understanding a theory of change, having a strong and robust business model, recognising where there are opportunities for growth are really important activities in and of themselves. So we're really hopeful that the work we're doing in the Creative Industries Impact Lab and then below in a more broader 12-week impact investment readiness program will set organisations up for success, whether or not debt finance is the end result. So we feel like all of this work in and of itself leads to really great outcomes for the sector and may eventuate in some really wonderful impact investments. Lovely. So that's a brief summary of what we're doing at Creative Australia. I'll stop sharing my screen again because I think we might have time for a few more.
We do. So there's a couple that have come in. So, I mean, obviously one of them was great to hear what's happening in the UK. Is this form of finance and funding approach currently available in Australia? I mean, Jane, maybe I can throw that to you so I'm not just talking to myself. Obviously, there have been some investments in creative industries opportunities in the broader impact investing space, but in some ways we're working towards it in the work that you've articulated, aren't we? And would you like to add more there?
Yeah, absolutely. So there have been some more smaller scale investments that we've seen across Australia. I guess there's not a specific fund like Figurative that's generating investment for arts and culture. These are with intermediaries and funds that would invest in other assets and other things like social housing and disability support. So in a nutshell, yes, but there's not a kind of centralized space where this activity is happening like Figurative. And I think that's what we're really interested in Creative Australia is how do we bring it together and make sure there's a place to go for investment, capability building, and I guess community building too, building a cohort of organisations that are willing to share and understand the experience together.
Indeed. We had a question very early on. Does Figurative invest internationally, Seva? This is probably a question for you. Could Australian companies come knocking on your door?
Sadly, not yet. that's the dream, isn't it? To have a global fund and just share our experiences across all countries. But no, unfortunately, at the moment we're just the UK based funder, but we're working with partners around the world. So not just in Australia, but in Canada, Japan, Taiwan, to help get these kinds of funds off the ground in those jurisdictions too.
Indeed. And I must say, you guys have been so generous in helping support a global community of practice around this. It's been really important to building capability in a whole range of contexts in this work. So we've got a question here too around the different kinds of finance that could be unlocked by this approach, where it's a loan to acquire property or develop new IP with a trading value, and whether Creative Australia is considering similar applications locally in Australia, given it's a kind of departure from where we've been. I'll just start by saying our new legislation as Creative Australia enables us to take an equity position where we couldn't previously. So it does certainly unlock a new series of approaches for us to some challenging and wicked problems that we're facing. And yes, we are thinking about a whole range of applications as potential use cases for this work, and investment in creative IP is one of them. We also know, of course, and in Music Australia, music venues are a really challenging kind of area. So we're kind of obviously looking at that with great interest in what's been achieved there. Jane, do you want to add anything to that response?
I think you've captured it really well, Georgie. Yeah, I think
Right.
it's burgeoning for us, definitely.
Indeed. And, early stages, but one that we're approaching with a robust commitment, and noting that our Executive Director of Corporate Resources and our CFO, Tim Blackwell, is on the call and is very engaged with this, and actually visited some of those case studies that Seva took us through earlier in a recent visit to the UK, and started to learn kind of from on the ground. So looking back, there's probably just time for one more question. I guess sort of, you know, what would a successful model look like? And this is one perhaps to round out with you, Fran. What do you think is a really kind of successful model for impact investment? And are there some assets that are easier? Like what's the sort of low-hanging fruit in this space, and what are more challenging in kind of thinking about where this kind of thinking might be applied?
I think that's a great question, and it also speaks to the kind of aspirations for the market in a way. So I think currently what we're looking at is the proven business models. So a couple of the ones we've spoken about, I think will be, so Pink College is a great example of using this kind of capital to really scale an initiative to prove the concept and get access to the Department for Education funding, to get some access to some broader impact investment for further scaling. So that's really where somebody's spotted a hole in the market, has understood the real difference that actually being in a kind of cultural setting can make to the engagement in those kind of education initiatives, and really seen where actually culture is serving a function that can't be served by any other sector. And I think the kind of in terms of developing this as a notion, that really stressing those things where culture is a difference, and other investments. So we've got another organization who's working with prison populations through music. So really where that actually that kind of cultural engagement is kind of reaching parts that other interventions can't reach. But practically, if you're an organization, yes, it's probably easier to get funding where it's easier for us to see the business model because the market's more developed if you're renting out space or something that's really quite an obvious and clear model. But I think where it speaks to where we want to get to in the next 10 or so years is just really having that kind of evolutionary development pipeline from new ideas to scaling. So actually, we'd love to see a much broader array of initiatives that are being funded by and scaled by impact investment in our portfolios in the next 10 or so years. So we're really making sure that there's that possibility for an idea to be tested out, to be scaled out, to be rolled out, and then eventually to reach the point where that's actually something that other organizations can copy, or really seeing using this kind of finance to really show the breadth of what can be delivered by this sector in terms of business models and impact models.
Brilliant.
So sorry if that was a bit of a philosophical
No,
response.
I mean, I think that certainly that comment about really encouraging us to think about the value of culture and its contribution in new ways is really, really powerful. And I think it unlocks so many of the kind of challenges we've been facing around getting recognition for all those forms of social and economic return that have proved hard to quantify for a long time in our sector. We've got one final one that I think is a really interesting one from one of our colleagues in the Opera House who hosted us for our conversation when you were with us last year. Have Figurative seen an increase or decrease in philanthropic support for organisations that have been successful in impact investing outcomes? It's not one we've
That's
discussed.
a really interesting question.
Yeah.
It's a really good question, and I think the honest answer is that we don't really have the data points to hand to answer that question definitively. What I would say is that we do survey our portfolio to ask whether they've benefited kind of subjectively from our support around impact evaluation. And in most cases, the answer is yes. Whether that has specifically enabled them to better communicate and bid for philanthropic funding, I think that's an open question. But I suspect that, it makes sense that it would, right? Because they have a more specific, robust framework for talking about their outcomes that's been kind of tested and drilled into by an external funder, namely us. But that's something that we should look at, really. I think the wider kind of philanthropic fundraising environment in the UK is very challenging right now. So many previously successful organizations have continued to struggle to access funding because there's simply the many applications for a smaller and dwindling funding pot. So that's kind of the slightly nuanced, maybe slightly unsatisfactory answer to that question.
Yeah, I would say I don't have access to the direct data for this, but I'm pretty sure that, I don't have it to hand, but I'm pretty sure that in general, if you look across the trust and foundation sector, there is, skewing towards a focus on social outcomes rather than artistic outcomes. So where they are funding arts organisations, it's often a bit more towards the social outcomes rather than the art itself. But we do have interesting data as well on where actually people have come to a loan for us and haven't needed it in the end, because the fact that they've been through our due diligence process and been approved has unlocked access to different kinds of funding. So while that doesn't help us with our deployment figures, we do consider that a win because we've got this kind of market building remit. So, and actually, I don't know if we could talk about what happened with a big band at the weekend, Seva, in terms of we were approached to bridge a contribution that was coming from a very famous band to one of our investments, which you might be able to guess which one. And in fact, when they went back to the band and said, can they have that in writing? They said, it's fine, we'll give you the money now. So they kind of, we help them get access to cash in the first instance by asking for that. So that counts as a win, I think, for us as well. Any initiative that's getting more money into the sector feels like a win.
That absolutely does. Thank you so much, guys. And we really appreciate you getting up at ridiculous o'clock to share your insights with us. Seva very generously said that they're doing this in the midst of a cultural industries conference. It was a bit like being at a festival, which I think shows none of us get out anymore as well. Kind of sad. But thank you so much. It's been really, really, really fabulous to hear your insights and to have you answer these questions. For the medical critical friends we have across the sector and those who may wish to engage. Jane, did you have final thoughts or wrap comments you wanted to make?
I did just want to echo your thanks to Fran and Seva for the excellent work and say to everyone online, please do, if you haven't requested the guide, please do, it'll come through to you. And the Creative Australia team are there. There'll be my email address on the guide when you do get that email. So please feel free to reach out. We're keen to understand where people are and then be able to share information on the upcoming capability building programs that we'll be launching next year as well. So more exciting things to come.
Fabulous. Thank you everyone for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us. Great questions in the Q&A. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.